we're going to get started here. Welcome, everybody. My name is Rod Winsing. I'm one of the assistant city managers here with the city. And thank you for coming out on this cold night. Probably going to have record lows for today and tomorrow, but we're hardy Coloradoans and we'll do just fine, I think, at the end of the day.
School's canceled tomorrow.
That means you can sleep in, right?
I still gotta go to work.
All right. Well, good. What we'll do tonight, obviously tonight we're going to talk about community expansion fees. And the City Council asked us as staff is to convene this opportunity to talk about community expansion fees. I know Alan, through Nikki, has sent out some information to you ahead of time with the agenda and some other stuff to give you some history of the process. But essentially, the city's been in the CEF business since 1984. Is kind of when it all started. And the last time this was reviewed in kind of this type of format, a little different kind of format, but a community review, if you will, and a report to the City Council was back in 1997. So it's about time for another community conversation about this, talk about it, those kinds of things. And ultimately, the work of this group, we'll go into that a little later, will ultimately get us to a report that we'll have to go back to the City Council and give them a report, which will be late April. We're shooting for the 26th of April. So it's a kind of a tight timeline to do the work and get back to the City Council for information. With that little background, I want to do a couple introductions here, and then I want to go around and have you guys kind of introduce yourself and kind of tell us why you're here. I want to first introduce Don Sandoval from the Department of Local Affairs. Don will be our facilitator tonight. A number of you kind of who came in know Don. And, Don offices here in Loveland and is going to help us with the evening. Also, Ellen Krusmerich, who's the city's executive fiscal advisor and does a lot of our work related to investments with the city and also fees and impact fees. He does a lot of work on that. Alan's going to do a presentation for you too. So with that, we've got a lot of information that we want to get out to you and a lot of feedback we want. As you can see from our agenda, we need to get rolling with that. So with that, let's start up front. Matt, would you introduce yourself quickly and just kind of tell people what you do?
Matt Dellish Associates. We're traffic engineering consultants. Been here in Loveland since 1975. Been in business since 1980. There's three of us. Only one of them here tonight, though. We do a lot of traffic studies for some of the people in this room.
I'm Gerald Benner with Sightstone. Last project we did, we're a local developer, commercial. Last project we did was the former water pick plant.
I'm Dave Clockman, the city engineer, and just started my 9th year here at the city.
Sean Cronin, interested resident, citizen of Loveland, and I just started my term on the Parks and Rec Board.
Eric Colesapple, local commercial development.
Ken McCready, commercial broker with Miltech.
Harold Smith, semi-retired architect and engineer. Hi, Al.
Carol, how you doing?
I'm the construction advisor.
Dixie Schmatz, I'm a former City of Loveland employee in long-range planning, and I was one of the people on this original list, so I think that's why I got invited.
Jay Hardy with McWinney and Services General Manager at Centera.
Ken Barrett with Landmark Planners and Engineers, and Nikki promised me there'd be wine tonight, and I think I was fooled. That's why I'm here.
Tony Janisek, local developer, integrated development services, development consultant these days.
Dan Hill, I'm on the transportation board, and I'm a commercial broker.
I'm Brian Hayes. I'm in the Parks and Rec Department and manager of the Open Lands area.
Chris Ortman. I'm in my 3rd year on the Cultural Services Board. Dave Clark on the CFAC, the Citizens Finance Committee, and also a former city council, so dealt with these for the last several years.
Gary Haven, Director of Parks and Recreation, and I've been with the city longer than I'd like to tell you.
How many years?
Long time.
Tom Hawkinson, City of Loveland Building Division. We're right in the middle of capturing all the capital expansion fees in all this process.
Al Hauser, Hauser Architects, in business in Loveland since '84 and a resident since '75.
Greg Mahonen with Timberwind Land for the last 9 years, formerly with the City of Loveland Engineering Division.
Bob Even, I'm chairman of the library board.
I'm Scott Bray, residential developer and builder.
Roger Hoffman, a citizen and member of the 97 Citizens Committee.
I'm Merlin Green, Fire Marshal with Loveland Fire and Rescue, and I've been here not quite as long as Gary. I've only got 27 years in, so.
Thanks, everyone. Next on the agenda. You want to stand up here? 'Cause I want to hand it off to you.
Yeah, right? Because the process that we're going to be going through, is that what you want to talk about?
Yeah, just briefly.
Just briefly?
Tell them the ground rules.
Okay. Basically, first of all, let me tell you about me. Don Sandoval, Department of Local Affairs, is a state agency that works with local governments. That's what we do. We provide a lot of different types of services to local governments. We've helped with the Loveland Library and their expansion, their new expansion, and we've done some other projects over the years with the City of Loveland and other municipalities and counties throughout northern Colorado is my area. I cover Adams, Boulder, Larimer, and Weld, and Broomfield and Gilpin counties for the department. My office is here in Loveland at Palmer Gardens, and I've been in this office for 27 years. Know a little bit about the area, not the community as much because I live elsewhere. Basically what we want to do tonight is Alan is going to go ahead and make a presentation about the capital expansion fees and discuss and open it up for questions a little bit after that presentation. And then we're going to go through a process where we're going to develop some of the issues about capital expansion fees that we have to discuss in this meeting tonight. Then we will break up into some groups to talk about how to look at those. What we're going to do is look at those issues. We're going to see in each of the groups, we want you to come up with recommendations and solutions to those particular items that we'll come up with, and then so that in the end of tonight, after you make your presentations out of that group, we're going to take this information and we're going to give it to a group of of citizens that are on committees that deal with the capital expansion fees. That particular set of folks will then come up, will work very hard over the next month, come up with a set of recommendations and come back to this group in March, early March 7th, and then so that they can get your feedback as to what if they were on track or not, and so that we'll have the feedback meeting at that point in time, and then they'll go back and work on it again so that they can get your input and then put it together for the City Council. City Council presentation in April the 26th. So that's the idea, that's the process that we're planning to use to get the information to the City Council. And after that, it's up to them in their process. So, yes, sir.
April 26th, is that a study session, City Council, or a voting session?
Study session.
That I don't know. I didn't know.
You
So,
don't need to.
yes, I'm on yes. So, then they'll be working through that process, and it's up to them after that to see what they're doing. So, I guess now it's time for Alan to make his presentation.
Okay, I'm Alan Kirchmarek, Executive Fiscal Advisor. I'm going to stand over here. Shane told me that these mics pick this up the best, and the reason we're doing it with mics on is we are recording tonight. Councilmember Klassen said so many people are going to be interested in what we talk about tonight that they don't want to miss it, so it's going to be on compact discs. We're going to sell them. And no, we're not going to sell them. A few people looked up. But anyway, we're going to have it available on the city's website so that if there are more interested parties that want to see what happened here tonight, they can see the presentation and also see the results of your brainstorming when you break out into your groups and then report back later tonight. So myself and Dave Klockman will be doing the overview of the streets fees. I'll be talking for about 10 minutes, then Dave about 10 minutes, and then I'll finish up. So our presentation is intended to lay an informational foundation, not only for you, but also for people that might view later. As I look around the room, I can see that most of you have had some experience with the capital expansion fees in the past. I want to thank Dixie for coming, Roger for coming. When we tried to contact the people that worked on the subcommittee in 1996 and 1997, every one of them said that they would like to be here tonight. Due to the weather, a couple didn't make it, and due to prior commitments to play golf in Arizona, I know, tough duty, a couple others wouldn't be able to make it, but we were able to talk to all 6 of the people on that subcommittee, and they were all still very interested in how capital expansion fees serve this community. We also went back and tried to get the people from 1981 through 1984. There were 20 members on that committee. We didn't have as good a luck. We were able to contact a few, but we gave them a pass on tonight. So their experience led to the original study in 1984, which led to the fees. So I just want to be specific tonight. We're not going to be talking about any of the utility fees. The city does have system impact fees for water and wastewater. We also have plant investment fees for the electric and the power. And we have system improvement fees as well for storm drainage. Because all of those are governed by individual studies and pretty much stand alone and are based on a business model, they're run as enterprises, we've set those aside. If at some time you want to talk about those, we can bring that information in. But tonight we're talking about 10 capital expansion fees. Dave is going to be talking about streets, and I'm going to be trying to cover the other 9, the fire protection, law enforcement, general government, library, the museum and cultural services, parks, and then recreation trails and open lands. In this room, you heard the introductions, we have members from the boards and commissions. We have members of the development, retail, finance, banking community. I don't know how many bankers. Any bankers show up? We were supposed to have a few bankers here. We've got the staff liaisons to some of the boards and commissions, and our intent is to have a good discussion, knowledgeable people discussing the issues that you've had over the years, the ideas that you might have for the future. It's supposed to be brainstorming, and the other challenge that Councilmember Klassen issued to us was keep things civil. I know you might have differing opinions, and we'll recognize that up front, but tonight is supposed to be brainstorming, and we really want to get as many ideas out there as possible. And really, I'm sure there might be some differences of opinion, and might be some debate that you'd like to take on, but right now, for the purpose of this meeting, we're just trying to get information on the table. I'm going to go through these slides. We're trying to put this presentation together for other people to watch. If you have questions, I would say please note them on the slides as we go through, and then we'll bring them back at the end. So with all those preliminaries out of the way, I'm going to start with the presentation. Those of you that have lived in Loveland know that this is a very conservative community. I mean, it's always be conservative. This company is very careful in its spending decisions, and the department heads and the city council, they know how to exercise a spending control. So this place knows how to save money, knows how to cut back when it's time to cut back. Another premise we have that it's okay to save up for the future, and that goes with the third bullet here. I say we prefer pay-as-you-go financing over debt financing, and that's something that the council is extremely proud of, the fact that the city has virtually no public or City of Loveland issue debt, and that goes with number 2. If you're not going to issue debt, that means you really do have to accumulate the money in order to do capital projects. So those go hand in hand. Fourth item up here, keep tax rates low. The mill levy has been at about 9.6 mills since the early 1990s. That coincides with the Tabor Amendment. As you know, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights requires an election to change tax rates, and since then the city has not attempted to do a mill levy increase. Sales and use tax rate has been at 3% since the late 1980s. In 1984, the result of the service cost recovery study was that growth should pay its way, maybe it should say should pay its proportionate share. And then the result, the bottom line is Loveland as a city has been successful from a fiscal and I would say a quality of life perspective. Just a quick look at the local economic and revenue-based trends. How many of you were here in the 1970s? So about half the group, a little over half the group. How many people were born before 1946? So just a few. Anybody born after 1964? So only one non-baby boomer, two non-baby boomers. So we've got a few that were born before the beginning of the baby boom group and a couple afterwards. And some of the research shows that that's very important to these economic and financial trends that we're going through. But I'm not going to blame anything on the baby boomers at this time. And those that came after are not innocent either. So, 1980s. After really rapid growth in the 1970s, it nearly doubled between the beginning of the 70s and the end. In the 1980s, things slowed down a little bit, but still pretty rapid growth. 1990s, continued rapid growth. And then this past decade, we had some big expansion with the Centera project coming online in 2005. And then since then, beginning of 2007, the financial markets started to unwind at the end of 2008, the national recession. And now we're in this very, very slow recovery. Some people are hesitant to call it a recovery. A lot of the economic indicators suggest that we're starting to turn the corner. And then I mentioned, if we look out a few more years, the baby boom echo starts around 2015, 2016. So we should see, not near the extent of the baby boom generation, but we should see a baby boom echo. A few more comments on our economic and fiscal base. In the 60s and 70s, retail locations here were actually shifting away from the city. One of the big events was the opening of the Foothills Mall in Fort Collins, and that hurt many communities in northern Colorado as people decided to travel to Fort Collins. And one of the big concerns that Loveland has had for several years is that leakage of sales tax going out of the community. Our community depends on sales tax for about 54% of its general fund, not quite as high as the statewide average. Most municipalities are over 70% dependent on sales tax. So sales tax is really the lifeblood of communities in Colorado. Loveland has got a little bit more diversity. In the 1980s, I would say at the beginning of the 1980s, there was a lot of pressure on the city budget from the 1970 census to 1982 when the cost of service study began. The size of the city's budget went up 6 times over a 12-year period. Now, everybody remembers what was going on back then. We had double-digit inflation for a number of years. We had interest rates, 15, 16, 17, even higher percentage for some of those years. So there was a lot of inflation packed in that period from 1970 to 1982. But it put a lot of pressure on governmental service, put a lot of pressure on the city to be able to provide services. There was a large tax package that was put out, and maybe some of you remember that, but it was turned down 70% against, 70% to 30%. And that led to that, that service cost study that I mentioned. 1990s, we saw some expansion to our retail base. In the early 2000s, late 1990s, we saw some of the big boxes located along Highway 34. Had some more out on 287 North. Orchards got started. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, Centerra came along and really changed the environment here. And as you know, if there's anybody that's not been impacted by the recession, let me know, and we want to know your secret. Just a graphic here shows the population growth. It's quadrupled since 1970 and up about 80% since 1990, so not quite doubling. We tried to run the bars out to the right to figure out when build-out might occur, but what we've seen in the past couple of years is a tremendous slowdown in population growth in Loveland. We were running well above 2%, 3% for a few years. Now we're back in the low 1.1, 1.2, so population has slowed down quite a bit here. It's slowed down almost everywhere. People are just staying put, not as much migration and not as much natural growth as well. Just another graphic here that shows that land area within our corporate city limits due to annexations and expansions increased by 60%. Number of streets that Dave and his group have to look after have increased by 85% since 1990. All of this costs money. It takes a lot of money to run a city. So how did Loveland cover the costs of capital expansion? Before 1984, pretty much all through taxes and fees. When developments were trying to get built here, I don't know, anybody work on some development before 1984? Do you remember if there were any exactions where developers would have to put in public improvements, or was that mostly done by the city?
It was mostly done by the city.
So it was mostly tax-based at that time.
Yeah. Not so much the part of the development itself, but certainly anything that led to the development, I don't think is something that was developed that way.
Anybody else got any opinions on that, Dave? Do you have any history on how streets were paid for prior to 84? I do not. Okay. So every time I go back through the files and look for more information on this, more and more information surfaces. This past fall, somebody gave me a file I'd never seen before, and it had all kinds of things about Dixie's work and Mr. Hoffman's work from 1997. I mean, I'd seen, a few pages here and there, and somebody handed me something. Here's all the files and the minutes and everything else. So there's a lot of history behind how Loveland has done things, but we're still backfilling it. So if you come across something, feel free to share that with me. This is the study from 1984. A group called Brown, Bortz, Coddington, BBC out of Denver, helped the planning department put this together. This study, the service cost recovery system, identified that revenue shortfall that the city had and suggested that there were ways, basically impact fees, that could be used to address that problem. This study and this system of fees actually received a national award from the American Planning Association for innovation in public finance. So it's been an example for communities throughout the nation, and it's served the city here pretty well. After the 84 study was done, and I'll show you a graphic later that reinforces this, the fees were left exactly the same for 10 years. In 1994, despite what was in this report, which insisted that you should have an annual increase for inflation, no inflationary increases occurred between 84 and 94. In 94, people noticed that and decided that we needed to get that inflationary adjustment going again. In 1997 and 1998, BBC came back and worked with the city staff and added in some additional costs. Before, they were building fire stations, building other buildings, but not getting to the equipment that was necessary to operate those facilities. So that was a big breakthrough for the city. It started with the fire department, started to look at those expensive trucks and other equipment that they have, as well as some of the other computer equipment that's needed for dispatch. Those were added in 1997, and then that theory was applied in 1998 to some of the other well, I think all of the other fees as well. I forgot, in 1994, recreation and trails were added. Prior to that, they were all rolled into parks or were a subcomponent of the parks fee. In 1994, they were broken out to become a separate and distinct fee. 2001 was the addition of the open lands capital expansion fee. In 2007, because of what has occurred at I-25 and Highway 34, the Centera expansion totally changed the ratios between the amount of retail and the amount of residential in our community. That was one of those major changes, and because we distribute our costs based on land use, it was time to update that. So in 2007 we did that. In 2009 we did an update for inflation, and there was actually a decrease in building costs, so fees were reduced. And we also put in place a temporary fee waiver, a fee reduction, not a complete waiver, but a reduction for multifamily projects. I believe it was a 61% decrease in the amount of capital expansion fees paid on multifamily. And that ran from the middle of 2009 to the end of 2010. And there were a significant number of multifamily units built in that period. 2010, last fall, we made the presentation to council about the recommendations for capital expansion fees for 2011. They expressed concern about inflation, the inflation adjustment not being made, and that's one of the reasons they wanted us to talk more to the development and the building communities to talk about how inflation fits in. So they also assigned us to do this exercise and get additional input from you. Here are the basic premises from the 1984 study. These were actually developed by the council, and these were assigned to the committee that worked on the study in 1984. So going into the study, this was direction from the council in a resolution. New development should pay its costs for general fund services as well as utility services. So they recognized that the utilities had a business model that worked pretty well for capital, and they were extending that concept to the general government or the tax-supported side. Service levels required for new development should not exceed nor be less than service levels already provided to the existing community. And this gets into the basic theory that capital expansion fees are only meant to address new growth in the community. You're not supposed to go out and repair old facilities. You're not supposed to improve or expand the level of service that you're being provided. You're supposed to measure the level of service being provided and try to, as closely as you can, replicate that for new additional residents and businesses entering the community. Funds collected from new development should benefit new development. So in the legal sense, I think they refer to this as nexus, that there's a relationship between the growth occurring and the impact on services that it makes. This next one, timing of fees should relate to the time of demands for service. And that might be a little bit confusing, but the idea was you could delay the collection of the fees to the certificate of occupancy. So the whole idea was there's really not that much demand during the construction period, but once the building is built, once the house is built, once the business is built and open, that's when the impact begins to occur. Were you asking a question or just waving? Okay. So we've had some interesting discussions about that over the past few years, and we really, as we go forward, really want to clarify and clean that up. General fund and utility funds should be consistent in their program and ability to serve new development. The idea here was we wanted to be able to meet the demands of new development. Basically, if you can't provide streets, sewers, water to support new development, you're kind of choking off that economic growth that you need to make the city run. So they really wanted to make sure that there would be money available for development at the time it was needed. And then this last one, I found, noticed just today, that they wanted a balanced community, and they recognized that they would work with a Chamber of Commerce to help draw in industrial and commercial development. I'd probably read this report a half a dozen times before, and I'd never noticed that bullet, but they really recognized that they had a partnership with the Chamber of Commerce at that time, and they really expected the Chamber to be helping us out with industrial and commercial development. Today we have a business development coordinator and are probably more aggressive in trying to bring new business and new job opportunities to communities than we did in the 1980s. So the result was these 7 fees, parks and recreation, all combined together: fire protection, law enforcement, library, museum, general government, and streets. And the report from 1997 was basically kind of a checkup on what had transpired from the first report. Their charge was to evaluate whether growth pays its own way, and to find out if the policies to ensure fair and adequate funding for growth-related impacts on infrastructure, social concerns, and the environment. So that's what council's assignment to the subcommittee was. Their conclusions very strongly supported the use of capital expansion fees. And at some point, I'm going to ask Dixie and Roger to comment on that effort and that result. But it was a very strong endorsement of what had been done prior to 1997. The city needs to determine the true cost of growth, so they wanted, again, to be very accurate of what went with growth and what went with the existing community. Decisions about the fees should be fair to everyone. Fees should cover capital costs to maintain current levels of service, including improvements necessary to accommodate growth. This is a little bit different than what was said in 1984, but they reinforce that betterment and ongoing expenses, such as salaries, operating costs, shouldn't be covered by the fees. A few more bullets from that study. The formula for service and system cost recovery should include the money that's already been collected. And economists debate whether or not the money that is just sitting in the bank waiting to be used on a project should be or should not be counted in the existing level of service. The city of Loveland decided that it should be counted. If fees are waived, now this one's very important because we get a lot of requests for waivers. If fees are requested and are waived, they recommended that the money be replaced from another source. So basically, if you want to give a project a break, the general fund or reserves will have to pay for that privilege. And then another iteration of you need to keep the money apart. So you've got different types of fees. They need to be kept separate. They need to be carefully accounted for. And we can go back to 1984 and show you how much money was collected in 1984. We can show you when it was spent. That's because every one of these capital expansion fees has their own checkbook. So keep the fees up to date, keep the fee structure simple. Cost of growth funds collected can be spent anywhere in the city. Now, some communities will allow impact fees to vary between one part of the community and another part. Sometimes they set up impact fees that are specific just for a single development. Because Loveland is a relatively small community, every one of its services is considered to be a system, and we have kept that one service, one system citywide theory up through this day. It might be something that you want to talk about in this group. And then they recommended that a handout be prepared for the general public, and I believe we emailed that out to you so you could have that for preparing for this discussion. And the idea was people really need to understand how these fees work and how they contribute to the community. Here's a few examples. For each one of the fees, the white lettering means projects that have already been finished. The yellow, those that are underway. Is Chilson done yet, Gary? Okay, so I should have moved that to the fix. But we just tried to come up with some examples, and if you want more, I didn't think with this group that we would have to demonstrate that money went to beneficial projects, but just wanted to let you know that there's a big list of projects that have been done over the years, and we've got examples for every one of them, how fees have been put to project use. This is a little chart that we use with council to try to reinforce that you can't just think of just the building or just the operating part of a building. You've got to think about replacement, repair, and salvage. It's just a life cycle cost. I know many of you probably use this theory in your businesses. This chart is just intended to show that impact fees are only for one purpose. That's to build capital improvements and buy capital equipment. So basically anything you use capital expansion fees for needs to have an accounting life of at least 5 years. So your fire station would meet that, your fire truck would meet that, your police cars would probably meet that, although they like to turn those over a little bit sooner. But any equipment that has an expected life of 5 years or more can fit into capital expansion fees. The solution from 1980s is still in place today. Growth must pay for its proportionate share. Fees should and will accurately reflect actual growth costs. And once this new development buys into existing infrastructure, the ongoing operating charges will be similar to those of existing developments. So this is just fulfilling that theory that was set up in 1984. Only the costs associated with the provision of services will be reflected in development fees. System must be practical, and I believe we've kept it practical, although sometimes it seems pretty complex, and we'll take your assessment on that as well. And basically, we've used that system since 1984 up until today. This is just a quick picture, and this is intended to be capital expansion fees going back to 1984. Over this period of time, we've collected about $107 million in capital expansion fees. The big winner is the pavement color. That's Dave Klockman. About 44% of the fees collected since 1984 are transportation. The next biggest one is parks. And then after that, they get smaller fast. But general government is about 9.9%. That's third. Then recreation. And then you can see how they distribute. But $107 million since 1984. So I was trying to figure out, if we didn't have these fees in place, how would we have paid for these improvements? How would we come up with $107 million over that period of time? And if you look at sales tax, it would take about 0.8%. So instead of having a 3% sales tax rate like we've had for the last 17, 18, 19 years, it would have been 3.8%. If it would have been on a mill levy basis, anybody got any best guess on that? Our mill levy's been at 9.5, 9.6 since the 1980s. In order to come up with that $107 million through property tax over that same period of time, we would have needed 11 additional mills, so more than double your property tax. So really significant amount of money has been brought into the city for capital improvements through capital expansion fees. So we're going to go over the basic methods of calculating some fees, and I'm going to let Dave give me a break. He's going to talk about the fees for streets, the capital expansion fees for streets, and he's got a short presentation here, and then I'll come back and close after that. So just a process check. Is everybody tracking? Are we going too quickly, or is this about right speed for you? Mostly nodding. Nobody nodding off yet. Okay. Oh, I was supposed to do F5, wasn't I?
No, F5.
There, starts it. Perfect. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Alan. The presentation that I'm going to do was originally done a few years ago when we were updating the capital expansion fees as part of the adoption of the 2030 street plan, which I have a copy of with me. I actually never go anywhere without it, so. And I have it on a thumb drive, and it's actually a safety pin to my pillow just in case. But that was a really extensive process, and out of that process there was a lot of traffic modeling. So for the next 90 minutes, I'm going to talk about how we build a traffic model. And then I'm going to use the 10 minutes to talk about the fees that Alan had allotted me. No, I'm just kidding. Anybody that's ever heard me talk before know that that's always the joke I use, so I am consistent. So there was a huge process done, and the model was built inside of the overall regional model that's put together by the North Front Range MPO. And out of that, it was determined that these were the projects that needed to be constructed by 2030 in order to meet the demand based on the growth projected and the trips that were expected to be on our road system. The yellow are the city's projects as part of the plan. The green were those projects included in the Centera Metro District's Master Finance Agreement. So all those lines on that map and those circles added up to $450 million. So of that, and for each really street segment, we looked at what is the funding necessary to improve that particular street section. Capital expansion fees are the amount based on growth. There were general fund. If you have an existing road that you're going to widen and you need to replace the existing portion, you can't use expansion fees for the existing portion because that's not growth related. So you have to use existing general fund money. Also, each road in that system was looked at to see, is there pass-through traffic? A good example of that is 287 or Taft Avenue. People drive all the way through Loveland and don't stop. So you can't use capital expansion fees to pay for that part of the road because it's not growth related in Loveland. It's regionally maybe growth related, but it's not specifically Loveland related. So you actually have to take that out. And that's calculated for each road section. The collector street equivalent is for each road, the development is responsible for paying for their adjacent to their property up to half of the cost of a collector street adjacent to their property only. So you have to take that out because that is part of the equation. And then finally, excuse me, we actually at the time,
CDOT made you choke up,
well, I do choke over this number a little bit because there's no way CDOT's going to come up with 52 million.
That's the second part of your joke.
But 5 years ago, that was possible. So that was 250 million, and then there were 200 million in Centera. Wow, this is bad. I've talked about this so much, this is a really dry subject for me. So that's another bad joke. But there were 100 million in local improvements, and that was like Centera Parkway. It's hard to believe that's a local improvement. And then they also had 5 regional projects. The interchange at 25 and 34 was one of those regional projects. Just getting done now, completely paid for by the Centera Metro District. So it was street sections and intersections. And the costs for the capital expansion fees were based on proportionate share. That meant, and Alan talked about this before, so each use, you look at what the average daily traffic is going to be and how much of the trips you're expecting is that going to take. So the rationale was, we figured there were going to be 575,812 new trip ends each day based on that extensive traffic modeling we did. Alan, could you get me some water? This Diet Coke is not being my friend here. Thanks, I got one. So, thanks, Jay.
On that one of those trips, when you actually go to define that, is it point to point, or does it assume that when you go from A to B, there's a stop at the grocery store, there's a stop somewhere else? Where you get to
There is. I'll get to that. So that's a trip in. So if you start at your house and go to work, that's actually 2 trip ends. So each end is paying for part of that trip. So the way it was figured out is that, so basically if growth happened as predicted and all those projects were needed, you would collect exactly that amount of money and build exactly that amount of projects. If it was less, you would collect less money, but you would build a portion of those projects, and it still would be related to the overall total. And if it was more, then you would collect more money because you'd need to build more, but it would still be proportionally related. So the basis for the fees were, as I said, there were $123 million of CEF projects identified. There were 575,812 trip ends predicted, so that worked out then to $213.68 per trip end. And now that's grown to $226.71 per trip end. Before the 2030 plan was adopted, it was about $300 a trip. So when the 2030 plan was adopted, it dropped it by about from $300 down to $213. And remember, there were $100 million of local streets in the Centera project. So I reported to groups and to council that if those $100 million needed to be added in, we'd be having a whole different discussion because we would raise the rate, but we were able to actually lower the rate and accomplish the same thing because we had what was then a new source of revenue that we didn't have before. So the proportionate share impact fee, this is to answer your question, Jay. You take the ADT from the ITE manuals, the average daily trips, you multiply it by the percent primary trips. If you're going to work is a primary destination, that's 100%. If you're going to the gas station, the ITE shows that maybe around 20% of the people that go to the gas station, that's their primary destination. The rest of them are on their way somewhere else. So you actually would multiply that by 20% and then by the cost per trip. So it actually works out. And both the ADT and the primary trips are from the 8th edition. And this is really important, is that a project had to be included in that list in order to be eligible for reimbursement. So it had to be in the plan, the fee had to be calculated for it in order for us to collect the fees and for a developer to get reimbursed for the oversized portion. Otherwise, it wasn't figured, so it wasn't part of the system, so it wasn't eligible for reimbursement, so a development would have to pay 100% of the cost of that. So, as part of this, we also looked at how the cost index would work. And at that time, we were actually using ENR, and ENR takes into account all kinds of costs, building costs, and so it really didn't relate well to what we were doing for streets. So it was determined that we were going to use well, this rarely happens. Anybody that's ever heard me talk knows I can go on for days. So there was a system adopted that we would do full estimates whenever we're doing a full update of the plan, and in between we would use CDOT's cost estimates. And there's a cost index, and I've got a slide that shows what that is. It actually increased 6.1% in 2009. The plan was adopted in 2007. We adjusted them up 6.1% in 2009. We have not adjusted them since, and I'll show you why in a minute. So, and then we're going to repeat the overall cost estimates with a transportation plan update. And we actually we just started the process of updating to the 2035 plan, and we should have that done by the end of this year. So there'll be a number of presentations to council and to the Transportation Advisory Board, because we're going to recalculate all the streets that are necessary to be improved, the trip ends, and then relate those two and bring a proposal back to City Council for direction and adoption. So we were asked to monitor the available other cost indices other than CDOT's, and there aren't really a lot out there that relate specifically to streets. And we've determined that CDOT's is really still the most appropriate, so we're still using that. So what does CDOT's look like? This actually goes back to 1987. And it goes up, and then it's kind of flattened out, but there are some definite spikes in 2008. I mean, off the chart. Excuse me. And what's been going on lately is the costs are really bouncing up and down. So what we've done is, so the last time we adjusted them was in 2009, and that was based on 2007. Because CDOT actually, even though they report quarterly costs, they actually only take a look at how it compares to previous costs based on how much work was done once a year. So really their fourth quarter report is the only one that they actually consider to be accurate. And I talked to the folks down at CDOT and said, "What's up with that?" And they said, "Well, we've been trying for 5 years to change the system, but we just haven't got to it yet." Well, wouldn't you think that's kind of important? But so that's why I choke on CDOT a little bit. This is where we're actually at in Loveland. So the last adjustment we made was in 2009, based on the 2007 four-quarter average. So we're actually below, but tracking right in between where everything's bouncing up and down. So we actually feel pretty good about where our costs are at right now. When we do our estimates, we look at 50 different categories. CDOT's cost estimate index is only based on 6 categories. So that's why when we do a full update, we update everything in the report, or everything in the cost estimate, and then start over and then go from there. So just a few examples to further answer Jay's question. So you take a look at, so for a single family detached, it's per unit, you have a ADT of 9.57. It's 100% primary trips. So 9.57 times 1 is 9.57 times $226.71 gives you a fee of $21.69. I think the fee was about $2,900 before we adopted the 2030 plan, so we're still quite a bit below that. When you look at a fast food with a drive-in, it's per square foot. That's the trip rate. 30% of the trips are considered primary, so that results in 149 trips, so it's $33.74 a square foot. So you're actually, when you pay that cost, you're actually buying your proportionate share of the trips that you're using that are directly related to growth by the year 2030. So that's how that's really figured out. And my last slide, and we figured this out for every category, and we use ITE for every category. Have a lot of discussions with Matt about this particular table. So we're going to save questions to the end. I'm going to turn it back over to Alan. There you go. Perfect. Back on your slide.
So there are a couple reasons I wanted Dave to step in and talk about streets first, because one, streets is about 45% of all of the CEF collections that we've got, and two, it's the most elaborate data set and analysis that we've got for any of our fees. So it's a very detailed, very strong research-based method, and we simply don't have the equivalent of ITE for any of the other fees, and we don't have something as simple as trips to apportion for the others. So we've got a different method for the other 9 capital expansion fees. I should say that the other fees do have master plans. Each one of the, from parks, recreation, trails, up and right down the list, they all have a plan for what their future is going to be. It's not, it just doesn't have that customer interface like trips, like Dave has. So I'm just going to go over briefly. I'm not going to go through the same type of calculation for all the 9 others. You'll be happy about that, right? But here's the basic steps. We start with land use. Every year from the county, we get the land use and valuations from the county assessor. And the only ones that really make a play in our CEF determination is residential, industrial, and commercial. So there's about 4 or 5, no, there's probably 7 other land uses that the county assessor tracks, but we do not use those for purposes of these fees. They would include things like institutional, they would include railroads, other things that really don't impact city services. So basically, we're looking at residential, commercial, and industrial. We determine the value of the buildings and equipment and other capital that we have on the city service provision side, and that is the basis that gets divided among the land uses. So most of our fees only apply to residential uses. Law enforcement, fire protection, streets, and general government apply to residential, commercial, and industrial. So if you've got a fee that is just allocated to residences, we simply divide by the number of housing units that we have in the community, and we get an average cost share for each one of those services. So we've got this value of equipment and buildings that we update based on our insurance records and our asset accounting records, and we just divide that by the number of units. For commercial industrial, it gets a little bit more interesting. We try to work that down to a per square foot basis. And that's been very challenging because, as you know, there have been a lot of properties in our community that have been kind of offline for a number of years. For example, the Agilent site, 800,000 square feet of industrial. How do you value something that's empty? How do you put that demand in with the other industrial property that's in the community? So that's been more interesting. And then as we have shifts from residential to commercial, or from high amounts of industrial down to very low amounts of industrials, you can see that industrial pays a less and less share of the total. Makes sense. And as all of the commercial came up online at Centerra, commercial took a greater share. So that actually offloaded some of the costs from residential. Just wanted to bring up a few questions about fairness and equity. More than half of the housing units now in the city have been built under the CEF system. For 25 years, it's been the city's standards. These CEFs have added to the quality of life and promoted growth. They're also integrated into the CIP, the capital improvement plan, that's part of the city's budget. When we adopt a budget every year, we appropriate the next year's capital, but there's also a plan in there for the next 5 years and then an additional 5 years. So we've got 10 years of capital improvements that we're trying to plan for when we put our budgets together. Just want to mention the concepts of horizontal equity and vertical equity. Horizontal equity means that people in the same economic situation should pay roughly the same cost. Vertical equity, and you might, well, based on your discussions, you might not find that we accomplish that with our fees here. Vertical equity says that the amount of fees you pay should be somehow proportionate to value of improvements. So I'll leave that up for your group. And then the final equity thing is the intergenerational equity. That says that different generations should pay roughly the same amount for improvements as the other. So no one generation should have to take on more than the others. Prior to 1984, everything was done through taxes, so existing residents really were providing the foundation for growth for newcomers. Beginning in 1984, the idea was switched around. It was pretty much newcomers, you bring your share, you bring your proportionate share to the system as you buy into the system. So that's something that you may want to get into in your groups. This is just the municipal code provision for an annual inflation adjustment. Dave said that they have been working with CDOT and trying to find a better one to go. For all of the other 9 fees, we use the engineering news record, construction cost index, and we use the one that comes out in September. So we try to get the one that's closest to when the council adopts its budget. And there are some advantages and disadvantages of that. This past year, it showed an 8.62% increase. Council decided not to go with that. The prior year, there was a 2.63% decrease. They did implement that. Going back and looking at September compared to other months, September actually gave the lowest possible increase of all of the months, including the average for the entire year. I don't know why, but for some reason September is about 3% lower than other measures of inflation using different months or the average for the construction cost index. So we didn't intend it that way, but it has had a kind of a leveling effect on the fees. This is just a picture of what our mill levy has been going all the way back to 1980. And here's the sales tax rate, just a couple of reminders to you. Wanted to take a few minutes to look at other cities. And in the orange circle at the top are our immediate neighbors, Fort Collins, Longmont, Greeley, and Windsor. Going to do some comparisons between sales tax and mill levies. And then also put in some further to the south cities, just sales tax comparisons. Loveland is at the bottom on this chart and also the lowest sales tax in the group. Fort Collins just moved from 3% to 3.85% last November. Greeley's at 3.46, Longmont 3.275, Windsor at 3.2. Loveland also happens to be the lowest mill levy of this group, still at 9.564. Windsor, just the city, is 12. Longmont 13.4, again, just the city, and Greeley, just the city, is 11.3. Now, some of these other communities also have a fire district that people pay a mill levy for. In the city of Loveland, the fire department's costs are covered by the city's mill levy. There's not an additional district charge. Same thing with libraries. Fort Collins, Windsor, Greeley have library districts, so they've got an additional mill levy for that. That's not included in this mill levy comparison right here. If we look at total mill levies at some of the other communities, Johnstown, and the reason I picked Johnstown is because we heard from some developers that there were, just across the interstate, there is a subdivision that competes against building here in Loveland. Well, that development happens to be in a metropolitan district, and that adds 60 mills on top of the regular mill levy for that area. So that's why Johnstown got 157 mills for that area there. Berthoud came in at 94 mills. Windsor also had a metro district, came in at 131 mills. In Loveland, we do have some metro districts within Loveland. Most of the Loveland metro districts are in the Centauri area, and there's a few around Boyd Lake. I believe we have a couple in other parts of the city. But just doing a quick comparison, most places that we're pulling permits outside of the Centauri area are paying somewhere around 76, 77, 78 mills. Looking at sales tax rates, almost all of the communities down towards Denver have moved to higher sales tax rates in order to keep up with operating and capital costs, just running up and down the North Denver area, 3.50, 3.41 in Boulder, up to Broomfield, which is a city and county, at 4.15 as a high. The next 4 slides I'm going to go through really quickly. There's a group that used to be called the National Impact Fee Roundtable. And every year they have a seminar or a conference where they bring studies from various parts of the country. This study was done by an accounting firm, and they were trying to address the question, what happens if you waive fees? And these are what they came up with. In their report, the impacts on various groups. A public agency like the City of Loveland, the key impact to a fee reduction is a loss of revenue. From their study, the landowner was able to take that lower fee, and this is in 2008, so a lot of things have happened since then. They were able to get a higher price for their land than they otherwise would have gotten. They found the developers to be unaffected. They found residents and businesses to have to cope with lower facility standards. So they put together a couple graphics to show what a normal market looks like, what a slow market looks like without a fee adjustment, that's the middle bar, and then a slow market with a fee adjustment, and just tried to calculate what happened. And basically, you can see the fees go from $10 on the left to $5 on the right. The land value goes up by $3. The construction cost stays the same. Overhead goes up by 1%. I'm not sure why. And profit goes up by 1%. That's what they came up with based on a number of construction projects that they reviewed. They also looked at fee waivers on a cost of unit, and they found that the fees took the big hit, so $44,000, 100% of the fees were gone. Financing went down, and other costs went down. The net cost on the project was a reduction of 14%. The biggest hit was to the fee collection. They were arguing for fee deferrals so that fees could be deferred over time or paid over time. And their suggestion was that there's still an impact, there's still a negative impact, but most of it is absorbed by the financing and not by the fees, not by the quality of services being provided. So this was a 45-minute presentation when it was given. I did that in about 4 minutes. All right. Construction industry. Where's the construction industry today? I would assume you would, most of you would agree that things are still really tough out there. This recession was caused by overheated financing and a lot of stimulus for housing. A lot of risk was taken, a lot more risk than probably should have been taken. It was a national policy and reinforced by state governments, local governments, that anybody that could possibly own a house should buy a house, and the financing to go along with that was the rules were bent or relaxed in order to make that happen, and we can see what the aftermath of that has been. Our graphs of meter sets and building permits are all the same. We went from a extremely high level in 2006, 2007, record levels for the city of Loveland, down to extremely low. Our outlook for the future is that it's going to be a kind of a slow recovery. It's going to take a while to get back to where we were, and frankly, we may never get back to the levels that we were at before. There's one caveat to that. If somehow we land that project to redevelop Agilent, that could change everything that we've said, but that set aside, it's probably going to be a long, slow recovery. Outlook for the next 20 years, demographics alone that echo to the baby boom suggest 2015, 2016, there should be some people coming into the system that should help us out. So until then, though, probably pretty steady and slow progress. What I've got coming up next is a graphic of our capital expansion fees collected since 1992. This is for all 10 of the fees that we're talking about tonight. You can see we started at a really low level, under $1 million in 1992. 2006 was our peak year, $11 million and about $5.8 million. The dotted blue line is what went to streets, so we could try to keep up with the road improvements. All those others are jammed at the bottom, so I just broke those out for you. Here's law enforcement, fire protection, general government. These are grouped together because these are allocated between industrial, commercial, and residential. You can see general government was not quite to $1 million in 2006, and then you can see the real steep decline in the next year. Fire protection nearly reached $700,000, and law enforcement reached about $550,000. So everybody peaked and then fell off the table. We actually saw a little bit of growth here at the end of last year. We don't have anything on the near horizon that tells us that we're going to be able to sustain that level in 2011. You can see these up here. This is parks. Parks hit $2 million. You can see recreation trails, open lands. A little bit different curve for those, but same peak, same drop off. And here's two of our smaller fees, library and museum. Library helped build the expansion, almost reached $500,000, half a million dollars in 2005. Museum on that same chart, that same. Here's an example of how the library fees have changed over time, and all of the other ones look just about the same. The red note lines are just showing that we had a significant period in the beginning where we had no inflationary adjustment. You can see that flat line there. And then also in 2003 through 2005, we made no inflationary adjustments. You can see along the path there, there's some significant jumps between in 1999. You can see 1999 is up there twice. That's because in mid-year we completed a study which brought on a lot of the new capital improvements, which ratcheted up the base, which is distributed among the fee payers. So that happened in 1999, and then you can see 2002 is up there as well, a much more significant increase. And then we had another adjustment in between 2006 and 2007. So as major changes occur and we update that base, it tends to have a real uplifting effect on the total fees. And then you can see in 2011, right now we froze the fees at the same level as 2010. These were the findings that we reported to the council in the fall of 2010. One, I've already shared with you, build out is much further out into the future than we originally thought. We actually thought we might be nearing build out in 2030, 2035, 2040. Now we think it's beyond 2050, so our total build out's further out. The other recommendation we made is we really don't have any other revenue sources to keep up with the fees. I mean, if you want to go back to the taxes, I think I told you about the magnitude that we would have to have. So unless we can find and convince voters that other sources of revenue are appropriate, keep the fees in place, but we want to get your input on that, and we want to get your input on the reasonableness of those fees. Yes?
You've referenced total build out a couple of times, just without getting too deep into that. Is that 130,000 people? Is it?
It's about twice of what we've got today, so probably approaching 140,000.
And that's based on today's land area?
That is based on the 31.5 square miles that we've got right now. So if we added more land, there would be an opportunity for more population. The other thing that our planning staff talks to us about is that the future may have higher densities in certain parts of the city than we have now. So population actually may go higher, but just based on what we know now and the trends of today, the assumption is somewhere around 140,000 people. So it's pretty much a straight line. So we need to find the balance, enough fees to maintain our quality of life. And then what we really need to hear from you is these competitive considerations. I mean, a lot of comment was made that we need to look at what's in the surrounding area. We've tried to do that. And then the question is, do we set the fees on what our community needs or what fees are charged in other communities? These were. What's that?
You said you surveyed those other communities. That do you have that information where you are with versus the other communities?
We do have some information about that. Yes, I'm not going to present that tonight because Loveland has a broader base of fees. We use more capital expansion fees than other communities, and we've been at this longer since 1984. So our fees tend to be among the highest of the region. They also are among the highest in the state. Only Pitkin County is higher than we are. And then comparing to other states, again, I would say we're well above average.
I mean, to really answer that question, we're going to need that information. Maybe not tonight, to see where we are. If it's a relevant question.
I can bring that back at the end of this meeting after you do your breakout. I just updated, I'm working with some people in the region because we all update the fees about the same time. And we were just comparing notes between Loveland, Greeley, Fort Collins, and Loveland. And then I've got material that's a little more dated that goes a little bit broader across the state. But depending on which land use you're looking at, Loveland comes in different places. So among the highest on residential, lower on industrial. But I'll pull that stuff up and report that at the end of your session. Okay, so our assignment is work with boards and commissions and the public and do a public process. So that's where we are now. And I think at this point, Don, are you going to give them their instructions? And then we'll have breakout sections.
Sorry, yes, questions?
Yeah, if there's a few questions, we can take those. Yeah.
I'm fairly certain the answer is no. Is there any adjustment in any of the fee structures that moves toward revenue-producing areas? So if you had if you're saying 54% of the overall revenue in the county or in the city comes from sales tax, you produce a project that increases sales tax. Is there any metrics that helps feed the engine that continues that, where a residential may not increase the sales tax component, but retail does? Is there any offset of that in any way?
There's not at this point. Everybody heard the question? Jay just wanted to know if there was any adjustment towards land use. The example was a mall or a shopping center raises the sales tax. Should they get some kind of credit for that effort, and therefore the fees be lower? At this point, regardless of where it is, regardless of size, commercial is going to pay the same amount. Yes, Sean.
On slide 12, there was a point on there, if fees are waived, the money must be replaced from another source. Are there policies or criteria that allows for such a waiver in place, or is it handled on a case-by-case basis?
There are policies in place, and there are criteria that we use in our economic development policies, but usually it comes down to a case-by-case evaluation. So there's a standard set of policies, but in order to get there, we have to, in order to get the money from the council, they have to do an appropriation, so we have to do that justification too. Yes, sir.
You know, the higher fees that Loveland has as compared to the surrounding area as well as the state, it has a direct impact on housing costs, which has a direct impact on who can afford to be in this community. Are we to consider those kind of impacts too?
I would be surprised if you didn't want to bring that up. So I would think that's something that you would want to bring forward. And that's one of the reasons I brought up the taxing levels in other communities. So if somebody buys a house for, let's say, $200,000 in a metro district that has twice the mill levy that what Loveland does, Loveland has higher fees. Somebody would have to do that calculation to figure out, I can go to the metro district and live there 8 years before I catch up to that fee level that I face in Loveland. I don't know if people do that kind of math. I don't know if realtors help them do the math, but I would assume that a consumer would try to do that assessment and know how much they're paying for what they get.
Dave, on your streets numbers, is the assumption level of service C?
Yes.
You come up with those numbers.
Overall level of service C, and it's really based on the link volumes. So the big street sections, it's not looking at specific intersections because the model itself is a system level model.
Still, even like on Eisenhower, we still using even though the state is B, right?
Right.
Dixie.
One of the slides said at the bottom, the outlook for the next 20 years, demographics should improve by 2015 to 2016. By improve, are you indicating growth? Are you essentially saying that what, at least these slides are premised on, is that growth is good for the community? I'm just making sure we're clear before we start. What do you mean by demographics will improve?
What I've heard from a number of economists and people that practice the art of demography is that these trends, the baby boom generation, had financial impacts that were so far beyond our understanding when they occurred that we got used to something that we really didn't understand. So because of the baby boom, we had a stretch from the late 90s almost through to the year 2000 without a really serious economic downturn. And basically that was just so many people with so many jobs buying so much stuff. it just boosted the whole economy, and we forgot what it was like to have a recession. And we made investments and took on services as communities that have long-term effects, assuming that that would continue on in the future. In the 2000s, we've already had 2 recessions, and one of them perhaps the worst that has hit in a long, long time. Hopefully it's over. Hopefully it's on the mend. But what the demographers tell us is that we're kind of in a trough, and it's not until that next generation starts to become productive and consuming that it will draw us out of this recession. So
it's more the age of the population than the number.
Right, it's economic growth that is expected to come back around that time, just based on the demographics. Now, is it good? I'm not going to say growth is good. I'm not going to say it's bad. I just think it's something that we've got to deal with. And from here to there, we've got to figure out, well, we've got to figure out how to get there. Yes?
Dave, you had on one of your slides on the basis for fees, project must be included in 2030 cost to be eligible for reimbursement. Could you repeat that again or explain to me what that is? Is that to say if there was a project that came to the city that wasn't included in the 07 master plan, that you had shown another slide that broke out percentages that they'd have to sort of cover for that new growth? Did I understand you to say they have to cover 100% of that because it wasn't in the 07 master plan?
Right, it wasn't calculated in the fees, so it's not, they're all added up. So you'd have to, in order to keep the fees the same, you would have to remove a project and replace it with that one, or else they would have to completely pay for it. And most of those projects would be, when we go back to, let me go back to the first slide. The projects that we showed were really inclusive, and they were all around the city. So it was a little bit unlikely that there was, a large project would come in. Now there were some very specific projects, like an intersection improvement that wasn't shown in here, because pretty much all the intersection improvements shown in here are based on a previous council direction to only really consider the intersections of arterials with arterials. So if you had some arterial collector intersections, and you had to do some improvements there, that would have to be borne by that development. So, and because they weren't figured in, it's just the economics says that since you didn't calculate it based on the overall fee, how could you include it in without either removing something and recalculating the fee, or adding it in and recalculating the fee? And we're only doing that with major updates to the plan.
So have you had anything come in over the 3 years that's had to pull the full weight?
There was one, well, not really. There was a project that came before council, and council actually decided, you know what, we're not going to require you to do that. So there was, because you're not eligible for reimbursement, we're actually going to remove that requirement from you. But it's really handled on a case-by-case basis. But really, I mean, the list is pretty extensive. What's likely to happen when we update to 2035, not all these projects are going to be in here. So there's going to be quite a bit of dialogue with, around the community to make sure that there's a, that where everybody, there's a consensus as to the projects that are included, and that's the basis for the costs. So it's going to be a pretty involved effort.
Thank you.
If that makes sense.
The land area you were talking about for build out, your hypothetical build out, is that current in city limits, or is that the GMA?
You're right, Dave, it is the GMA.
Okay.
So this area represents, in the outline here, is what the GMA from the council means. Thank you for that question.
How are the connections or lack of connections handled? You've got areas that are in the 2030 transportation plan and they don't have a connection. So 34, they're
one right here. Which one specifically?
What are we doing here? How's this paid for?
Well, that already exists. So this is Madison Avenue, from 34 up to, so we had the intersection we just did as one of the projects, but up to roughly Silverleaf already exists in 4 lanes, so it doesn't need any improvement. But the section north of there, from Silverleaf up to where 37th is in Horseshoe Lake, will need to be widened to 4 lanes, so that's in plan.
I'm going to go for the record here. On slide 40 on your presentation, there was the library stuff, and I didn't see something or I missed it. Is that a % change from the previous year or in dollars? What is the y-axis?
That is dollars.
In $1,000 or?
No, that's the fee that if you had 1 unit residential, would pay about $123 to start here.
Per unit, okay.
Per unit, right.
Thank you.
Big jumps with the adjustments.
The big jump is probably an expansion and a redefinition of what is included in the cost. So a new computer system. Somebody else has that? Right. So wait till you finish. Okay. I didn't know if you were interrupting on this slide. So each time you see one of these kind of moves here, and then this one, there's been a significant change in one part of the Roger.
Yeah, has your department ever looked at what the fiscal impact would have been for all of that period where fees were not adjusted, say from, I think it was 97 to whatever, or that 90, I can't remember what that 10-year period, but I remember that well.
84 to 94.
84, 94, and then there were other periods when they were also similarly frozen. What was the city's, have you ever calculated what the city's sort of loss was at that point?
We've taken a look at that. I just don't remember the answer right now, but that's something we could put back together. I mean, just an inflationary increase. Inflation in this part was probably running around 4%, 4.5%. Probably a little bit less up at that other flat spot. But we could go back there and say, if inflation had been put in place, what would it have generated? Yes.
It has bearing on what we're doing today and what we might decide to do.
Any other questions? Does anybody want a break? You want to talk to them before they break?
First of all, what I'd like to do is, at the break, I'd like to move the 2 blue folks into the red group here, since we only have 3 in the red group. But we'll just put you 2 over there. I think just to balance it out as far as numbers of people. I'm not sure. Is that a good way to do it, Rod, or should we move? Okay. So what I'd like you to do in this next set of the process is that we want you to write down the key issues, the key issues that you would see in this capital expansion process that you would like to see addressed. What's important to you in going through this review of the capital expansion piece. So they might, somebody said that the fee's too high, or is the fee, are the assumptions made, proper assumptions made on how the calculation is made? Maybe those are some different issues that you may come up with. I don't know all the issues that there may be to address the capital expansion. That's the CIP, the right thing is where the locations are. And you can look down and look at some of those issues that you would like to see addressed. So I'd like you to write those down, 1 per sheet of these tablets here that we have down, if you could, for 1 for each issue. And then we'll come back, we'll have a little bit of discussion about some of the key issues. Then what we'll do is we'll have you break up or stay in your groups, but we're going to have you come up with how to address that particular issue. How would you address, how would this table address that issue? That each table would have their own issue to address, or in some cases, multiple issues. So that's going to be the process. And then I would like you to have somebody to, on your flip chart, be a scribe and probably the presenter. And then we're going to, we'll give you about 30 minutes to do that. And then we're going to give everybody a chance to, except for the scribes, to move around and look at how the other tables addressed a particular issue. This way you can get a chance to look at other issues rather than just the one at your table. And we'll spend about 5 to 10 minutes on that, and then we'll come back and do the presentations. So that'll be the process. Yes, ma'am.
So how much time are we allowing for identifying the issues versus, I see 45 minutes in here for breakout groups. What do you see us spending our time on here?
Well, okay. The breakout, I really would like to spend more, we're going to do about 25 minutes on looking at the issues. And then get into the breakout group. We're going to spend about 30 minutes for that, and then the 10 extra minutes, and then come out and make presentations. So 40 minutes there. That's my plan, still trying to, we started a little bit late because of the weather. So we'll get out of here by 9:20. That's where I'm shooting. So,
see how comfortable I did.
Yes, sir.
Can I ask another general question before we break out here?
Sure.
The $107 million that you indicate has been collected over the years so far in this program, is that spent?
Not all of it.
How is it determined how it's spent and when it's spent?
Through the capital improvement program. So it usually takes a number of
So
years.
it's already been decided by council on that program and how it's spent?
It's been programmed by staff and presented to the council. They only adopt a budget for the first year. So they don't lock in 15 years worth of projects or even 5 years. They only lock in, they only appropriate a year at a time. But when they balance that capital improvement program, they need to, usually they bump projects further out into the future in order to make things balance.
Where I'm going is it's pretty analytical to understand how you need to improve your streets, for instance, to keep up with growth. And David did a good example of showing us that. But it's not so analytical to look at some of the other areas like Parks and Rec, for instance. Fire and police, maybe population. So what sets those standards to say that this is what Loveland needs as the growth occurs in those other areas that aren't so analytical? What standard do they use?
Each one of the fee areas has a plan, and in that plan is a level of service standard. For fire and police, it might be based on response time. For recreation, it might be a per capita use factor. For libraries, the volume of books that they have and how fast they turn around. So each one of them has a different metric to determine their level of service.
How do those standards relate then to other communities? Higher, lower, average?
Probably all of the above. When we heard from our library staff, we had more usage and less funding, I believe is the answer. I don't remember all of the standards for all of the fees, but that's something we could get you.
I'm just trying to keep this in context as far as what quality of life standard do you use as compared to surrounding areas or the state or the national average for that matter, and are we really raising the bar and therefore the fees to reach that quality of standard that maybe others don't?
We have some experts here. Gary, could I call on you to talk to Recreation and Parks and just say whether our standards are about the same as other communities, significantly higher or lower?
Well, in recreation, there are certain communities that do not have recreation centers like we have Joseph. So obviously ours is much higher. They allow private to do that. As far as parks, when we set our standards based on where we locate a park, it's based on the area of coverage, service areas, and it varies. We're above on some and below on some. Some communities have extensive neighborhood park system, like we do. Some communities have just go for the bigger parks, the community parks. So it's how the comparison was made when the plan was put together, adopted by council. And they're revised every 5 to 7, 8 years. So that can change within that time frame.
Okay. One more question.
Well, actually, just responding to the last question, I could provide you a little feedback on that. I don't know what the current standard is, but interestingly enough, I had my own study of Parks and Rec per capita space and compared it to national standards. It was at the time a national organization for parks and recreation, and I looked at what their recommended standard were, and we were just a little bit lower than the recommendation at the time. I looked at this in the early 90s, mid-90s. At that time, we had about, if I remember the numbers correctly, I think I've calculated 9.6 acres per 1,000 of population of parks and open space. And over time, because the city did not continue investing in parks, that number dropped significantly. I don't know what your standard would be today or what you would have today, but that's notwithstanding the gift of several parks like Crow and the one that didn't yet get opened up on the north Mahaffey Park, and substantial open space that was contributed to by Colorado GOCO dollars on the trails. But overall, I don't think we fully maintained those standards, but at the time I initially looked, we were at least in the ballpark of national standards.
And one last thing, comprehensive plans, the land use plans that you go through in a municipality or in a county is, when it's setting your vision of how you want certain things to be. So, that's always an important factor, and then how all these other plans line up to meet that particular vision of what the community wants. So I think that's maybe an overall standard. I'm not sure if that does that here in Loveland. Most places it is the comprehensive plan that sets the larger vision, and then all the other plans seem to build to fit that vision. So I'm going to take a short break, so it'll be 5 minutes. We can just kind of rotate through here, and then what I'd like you to do, those that don't go out, you start working on what issues that you feel are very important that need to be addressed here in this process. That will try to keep the process running quickly. What would be your group's top priority?
If we did it right, we have no knowledge whether we did or not. Our top priority centered on the method of collection. How do you attribute the cost to a user? Is the collection method right? Does construction equate to growth, or vice versa? Does growth equate to construction? We really question the whole process of how it was collected. We looked at collection tools, which we decided were sales tax, property taxes, and CEFs. And what's absent from that is kind of a user tax. But we talked about the differences locally and regionally and nationally on how that's collected, and discuss the comparison of there's states in the Midwest where if you buy a new car to license it, the first year is $100 rather than the $400 or $500 or $600 that we might experience in Colorado. But their property taxes back there on a similar property are 2 times or 2.5 times as high as we might have here on a similar property. So we kind of came to a little bit of a conclusion that CEFs are maybe easy to pass at a local level because, one, you don't get a lot of opposition in passing them. They don't involve a vote of the people to increase a mill levy or a sales tax or a property tax. What have I missed?
The downside of that, though, is it focuses the burden for either maintaining the level of service or expanding the system. It focuses that burden on the backs of a fairly small segment of the population, which is simply the building permit applicants. By using the building permit as the collection tool, only the people that apply for building permits pay the fee.
And in that regard, we discussed a situation where if Scott's a native, but forget that. If Scott and I both moved to Loveland in 1975, and I've built and lived in 3 homes since I've been here, and Scott has purchased or built and lived in 1, I've paid much more toward the library and the museum and the streets, but have I used them more than Scott has?
See, there's an inequity in our collection system right now.
All right. Thank you very much. We'll do the black table.
Okay. Well, we had quite a few different ones, and so we did narrow it down to one as our top one, but we have several others that I think we would definitely like to turn in. But this one is that we need to consider what the CEF fee would be based on whether the property, or at least we need to look into this, based on whether the property provides income or not. So if it's retail or if it's somewhere that's industrial, something like that, that we would consider that, with the caveat that we could set aside part of the income that they would bring in so that the CEF fund would remain where it's supposed to be until that was built back up to where it should be, and then just bring in the rest of the income to the city. But essentially, it's to give them a bit of a waiver or fee deferral, I guess you would call it, if they were, depending on what income they might be bringing into the city.
For instance, sales tax.
For instance, sales tax.
We'll go to this table over here, the yellow table.
All right. Well, I remember one issue was to look at the level of service of streets. Loveland has level of service C. The state level standard is D. Fort Collins is D. Longmont is D. Greeley is D. Everything around the system is a D. And that could have a significant savings on the cost, the $250 or $450 million cost at build out. We think that ought to be looked at.
The road classification?
It's the level of service.
Level of service.
But that doesn't just apply to streets, right? That can apply to any CEF.
Across the board when you think about it, but we got 2 engineers here.
This was actually Dave Blockman's idea.
Reduce everything to a level of service E, I like that.
So, Eric, it sounds like you're starting with the premise.
Slow growth. Progressive.
I like it.
Now you're making me choke,
I was
Eric.
joking, sorry.
Is your table starting from the premise that the CEF amount is too high and should be lowered?
Yeah, yes,
Okay.
that it's.
So the problem,
it's cost prohibitive.
CEFs are too high.
Cost prohibitive right now, and can we afford level of service
Because
C?
the level
when
of
none
service
the
is too
surrounding
high.
communities or the state have level of service C?
Okay, thank you. Now the red table?
It's you, Roger.
Well, I hope we'll get to talk about all these concerns because there are a number of them, but the fundamental agreement was with the fact that growth needs to pay its own way through CEF. So the fundamental purpose of the program needs to be upheld and not compromised. But related to that, there are a number of questions and concerns about, and I'd like to at least capture those. One was a concern that perhaps at build-out, what would happen to unexpended CEF funds? There's concern that there might be too much in the fund balances that would be unexpended at the time of build-out. So that was a concern that should be addressed. Another is the allocation. There was some question about the fairness of the allocation, and that extended in two different ways, the way CEFs are allocated among residential, commercial, and industrial. Currently, commercial is exempt from some fees that residential pays. That's one of the aspects of that. Another is that is some concern or at least question of whether the city's adequately distinguishing between betterment and which is, improvements that benefit the whole public that are not necessarily related directly to maintaining a service level for growth, that, as we grow. Are we distinguishing fairly between costs for betterment versus actual growth impacts? And that, I think that's more in the form of a question as well. There's a clear need to have a better tie between the availability of CEF funds in various pools and the M&O requirements through the general fund. In other words, it's an issue of fairness. If developers have paid into a fund balance to provide certain amenities and a certain quality of life that benefits their projects, if the city doesn't have matching M&O funds to, like, say, to open a park, is a fairness question there as well. And then there's the question of distinguishing the level of service itself. The main question there was, there may be cases where, say, an external standard, say for fire, national fire standard, has increased, putting pressure on the local government to increase service level there. How is the city handling that? Is it doing a fair job? Because the program itself was designed just to maintain an existing level of service, and that's stated in the principles of the policy. So the question is, are we imposing new fees or higher fees to provide for actual betterment of an existing service level?
Green tape. We kind of discussed the premise for the vision of quality of life and how that affects the level of service standards that have been adopted in the plan to establish the fees, and kind of the unintended consequences possibly of that vision and those fees. And we came up with maybe two unintended consequences. One is, of course, who can afford to live here. So it's a diversity issue, if you will, of the residents coming in who can afford it. That's one. Number two is that vision, and therefore the level of service and the fees associated with it, really supporting one way or one quality of life within the community, which to me at least, and to us, is a suburban lifestyle, and discouraging an urban lifestyle where people with those kinds of interests have a different quality of life, have different level of service standards than a suburban community has. So are we really discouraging lifestyles, a diversity of lifestyles within the community because of the vision and because now of those set fee standards? You understand what we're saying?
So let me just check. If people wanted to live in a more urban setting, higher density, different lifestyle than the suburban label, there might be less costs to that because there's more compactness.
Not just less costs, but this level of service standards, and Matt and you guys touched on one of them. The transportation plan encourages that growth out to the outer ends of that 31 acres. So you've got level of service C all around the community. Well, what if you had E out there and you had a higher level of service inside the community to encourage people to come downtown? The people who like the urban environment don't need 7.5 acres per thousand of open space to enjoy themselves. Look at New York City. So again, the vision and everything that establishes that that quality of life may be just for a certain lifestyle that not everybody likes and would come in here. So again, to me, to us, maybe you're discouraging diversity of lifestyles and diversity of your resident population.
And
But-
our standard changed since we originally built.
Right, and I think the one thing we were discussing, I think, in consensus was, have we developed a CEF structure that begets a certain quality of life, or should we define a quality of life that begets a certain CEF? And that is, would we pay today for a quality of life that we may have we may have a CEF that is trying to buy a quality of life that we can no longer afford to buy? And should we completely rethink the vision of what the quality of life might need to be in Loveland, i.e. the level of service of roads, the level of service of the libraries, the level of service of the cultural facilities of this community, in order to establish a CEF that is more in line with today's economy and the future economy of our region. We may just be priced out of the market, which means that eventually you end up, you come back to a lack of diversity. We could end up being a community, a homogeneous community of just middle to upper middle class community with no other strata.
Or put another way, could Loveland have charged the CEFs we have since 1984 if Loveland was located in central Illinois or Tennessee or?
Absolutely right.
Alabama.
How much of our CEF was determined by our location and the desired?
Which ties to another one that we kind of do at the bottom is, a temporary reduction for the economy, like we did with residential.
So
that seemed to work pretty well for the multifamily until
Well,
the economy
yeah.
comes back.
But I think Alan was showing some things that showed if you lowered it, it may end up being a neutral effect or no beneficial effect. I just intuitively believe that if you were to lower it, you'd be incentivizing development, and until we start building things again, we may never climb out of this hole.
Because
we're here to.
cost prohibitive. I don't know where else to find it.
We seem to be talking about CEFs, which is the end result of quality of life related issues. Should we not be talking about what kind of quality of life we have and let the CEFs grow out of that? We're talking about adjusting CEFs up or down, but maybe what we need to think about is what does the whole picture look like first, and then establish a whole new structure of CEFs. We may have just gotten way too complicated for a system that was developed 30 years ago.
Thank you. What I'd like to do is, now that you take your top priority, and I want you to embellish on it and put more meat on those bones that you just talked about, and on these sheets of paper, and look at and do that, if you would, please. Is that asking too much? Take your top priorities and just write the topic on top of what that is, and then how you want to address that particular issue. All right? Do that in 20 minutes?
If we think the amendment of the element.
Oh, okay. Excuse me, yes. Good question. Jay brought up a great question, and it was brought up before. Yeah. How do we capture the other ideas that weren't the top priorities? So what our plan is to do is to take that list, those things that you have there, that they're not the top priorities from your table, and we're going to consolidate those. We're going to take those and write them up for the working group, and you'll see that what we've done as far as what we've written up, to make sure that hey, we've read your writing correctly. But so we're going to do that. We're going to give it to the working group, and then the working group can have all of the ideas to start developing that. And then at the March meeting, they'll come back, and we will have further discussion about their work And their task is to take not only all the issues and put it together and come up with a recommendation, not just the ones that we are talking about here today, these 5 of them that we're talking here today. So that's the process. I just want to get it validated from Rob that that's what we're going to be doing. So yes, sir.
Can you, I just got asked a question I don't know the answer to. Who is the working group?
Yeah. Okay. My understanding is, and you guys, gentlemen, will help me from the city, working group are made up, there's committees that are on the, it's not up there anymore, but that for each of the CEF groups. So there's somebody on the General Government Committee, there's somebody on the Parks, Trails, Open Space, Streets, Fire, and so on. And I think some of those folks might even be here tonight.
So it's staff?
It's staff.
Oh,
No, it's not staff.
It's members from the boards and commissions. Some of you might be here and want to continue on in this, but we told the council we would get input from the general public in special groups, but we would have the boards and commissions work with staff to consolidate this, massage this, and then bring it back for another group discussion like this.
So they're going to take the inputs from this group, the working group, they're going to edit it or change it, and then we're going to reflect back on that.
Right.
Actually, I think they're going to do more than edit it and change it. I think that the idea is for that working group to take all these ideas, sort of maybe consolidate them, figure out what are the top recommendations that they feel would start to come forward from this process, and then at their next meeting they would have some sort of draft recommendations that they are going to put together to present to you from all of the ideas that we have here tonight. And then we can have a session that they will make a presentation on what their recommendations are, and then we have a discussion about how that works so that they can go on to the next step, and that is to finalize those recommendations after they've heard from you, your feedback as to what they've come up with. But that's because your feedback to them is important so that they can come up with a recommendation to go forward to the city council.
And what are these recommendations you keep saying? Are they recommendations to change the existing CEF program, the vision, the premise to the vision? I mean, what are the recommendations?
Well, here's what we've come up with today. All right, we've come up with basically 5 top ideas about addressing the CEF system. So looking at the vision, I think was what you talked about. Looking at how the fees are collected. So all of these things that you've come up with today, this evening, those are the recommendations that they're going to look at and try to come up with. I don't know what exactly their recommendations are going to be, but it's sort of for my own purposes I wrote this, not for yours. So how to balance the CEF with income processes, income properties, I guess would be better. What are the level of service assumptions? Are they the correct assumptions? I understand over here. And the quality of life vision, how that impacts CEFs. Or do we want that whole vision of what is our city going to look like? What do we want our city to be? So I think it's all of the things that we're talking about here that you brought up. That's going to be their hard work to do. It's going to be hard work for them.
And we may not come to solutions by the time we have to go back to council, but we're going to get additional direction from council in April, and they might say, yep, go back and reinvent or relook at the whole philosophy behind this, which I think is a much bigger issue than some of the technical adjustments. We can tweak calculations and we can change from C to D, or we can move from 10 acres to 9 acres in order to cut costs. So, you've laid out a pretty broad, a pretty wide continuum from very philosophical right down to kind of nitty-gritty stuff. So we don't know how much we can do in 5 weeks, and we don't know how much we can do in 11 weeks. But what we're trying to get is, what are the common elements of your brainstorming, And if we can figure out what those are, we'll try to attack what's important there.
Aren't these likely some of the same issues that were grappled with in 1984 when this program began?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Does anybody know when the city is doing its next comp? I know you're doing the 2035 transportation plan, but what about the whole city comp plan update?
It's being updated this year. It was done in 2005, and we're beginning that work right now as well.
So I would just say in 95, probably a lot of you remember this, we tried to do an update to the plan, including transportation, because we were trying to mesh the two. And what I heard you all saying is, really, the CEFs could be a component part of updating the comp plan and saying, here's what it costs to have the comprehensive plan for this city that we want. Is that what we still want to do, knowing this is what it's going to cost us? And kind of do those two in concert versus each one on its own.
Right.
I don't know, just.
And we have an additional issue that some of you might be participating in. We've got this financial sustainability discussion that's going on with the community right now because of the recession and because of the services that we've taken on in recent years. We've got a revenue line that's growing faster than, revenue line that's growing slower than, I almost corrected it right there.
Meeting's over.
Expenditures, revenue. We got a gap, and it's staring us in the face about 2 years out, about $3.5 million. So that is on the operation and maintenance operating costs. This is more on the capital side. So we're trying to solve capital plan, financial sustainability, and capital improvement.
But again, isn't there a connection between those two? In other words, if you keep increasing your capital outlay to do these parks and open space and other things, your operational expenses are just going to keep increasing too.
I think it all gets back to, do you want a D or a C, or on the edges of town, do we want even less than that? Some places have taken their paved streets and put them back to gravel in certain parts of the city. So
I can see that.
My idea, your money. So, first of all, I would like to, I'll start collecting your other ideas. And then if you can start to put together ways to address the top priority that you've come up with. All right? The green group was last time. We'll start with you.
They may not have 18 in Minnesota. No, they probably do. I think there's over 300 in Colorado now.
Well, you'd have to go to the annual assessment. Once you go inside, I can't some kind of district.
Well, I think our group wants to maybe take a giant step backwards before we move forward. And that is, before we decide to look at CEFs, maybe we should look at what it is we're trying to afford first. So I think we want to reevaluate what the vision of this community wants to be in this new economy, and then evaluate the quality of life and the standard of that quality of life, and relate it back to all the CEFs currently in place. Not just assume that we're going to continue to afford the quality of life we currently have.
Now, you understand that that's the way bigger piece than what we're trying to get here, from you all, now. I mean, there is a comp plan process and there's a comprehensive plan. So you're asking the city to go through a long-term revision of the comprehensive plan. But in the interim, so what pieces would you be able to take from your thoughts to say, how do we cut that down into pieces between now and the time that it takes a comprehensive plan process to be done?
Well, I think what's being asked is for us to adjust the thermostat when in fact we may need to replace the furnace. And so I'm saying, I think what we're saying is maybe we need to leave everything status quo and deal with the real issue, and that is what is it we can afford? And either leave things the way they are or create a moratorium for a period of time in an effort to stimulate development, even potentially at an expense to the city. But, I mean, I don't know how you break it down. When you believe that there's a bigger issue,
Okay,
how do you...
Understand?
We may not be able to tell you how to adjust it.
Okay.
I don't want you to get we don't want you to get so big to think that CEFs isn't necessarily the answer. It's just how we're using those CEFs. It's maybe not really as big a scope as what you think, but we still got to redefine those standards for quality of life for each one of those different categories.
Okay, so if you could write that down there as well. And, in the meantime, I'm hearing maybe status quo for the CEFs until this vision is...
Or a moratorium.
Or
deferment. Or
whatever. Okay, all right. Thank you.
Great.
We'll have the yellow group.
We'd like to have the working group, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
evaluate the level of service appropriateness in each CEF category, and evaluate the assumptions in the comp plan affordable and achievable. For instance, level of service in streets, currently a C, what do we live with a D?
And meant for the other 9 services as well. Could we live with a lower park standard or library standard?
And then what would that save?
Which feeds right back into the comp plan and the master plans.
yeah, and we're not talking. We're talking about broad scope, everything, reevaluating library and cultural and roads, and just as Eric, articulated. That was great.
Yes, sir.
And the moratorium, don't forget that.
Damn good idea.
I'm going to be one of the ones working on that working group. And one of the things I keep hearing out here is quality of life issues. As I look at the list of the 10 groups that were going to be a part of this,
TORIU.
My definition, and I'd like to find out what the group says.
I think that's right.
The first 4, if you look at that first slide, the first 4 are essential services. The last 6 could be they are quality of life issues. So where do we start moving that? And those top 4 take up almost 60 to 65% of the CEF.
And when transportation goes to 70%, we should choose which one we want.
Good point. Good
So
point.
we got to, from my perspective in the working group, I'm going to need a good definition of what the heck you mean by quality of life issues. Is the fire department a quality of life issue? I don't think so. I think it's essential.
Okay. So, black group.
We didn't do much more than we did the first time around, but consider CEFs based on income coming into the city of Loveland, and consider setting aside potentially a portion of what we call the first monies to pay the original CEF amount. So we tried to provide an example. If a retail project would have paid $10,000 in CEFs and expects to capture $20,000 a year in sales tax, in the first 6 months would be set aside to be paid into that fund. So it's basically a self-fulfilling bucket. So it's not discouraging a project from coming in, but rather using the project's funds. It's really a tax increment tool. And then the second part of that is we didn't have a solution, but are there other categories, commercial, industrial, that can do the same through some matrix of job creation or property tax, using that fundamental to repay that. So it's really not about eliminating the CEF or not recognizing the need for them, but rather the timing and how the source of payment is provided.
Thank you very much.
The red group.
Well, we had similar discussions and kind of come up with some similar conclusions, although we didn't have complete unanimous decision on this. So we're still wrestling. But basically the question, what quality of life are we, and the definition of we is in question, willing to pay for? And we, at this point, like it was pointed out, is people moving in, or new people doing under building construction. That's it. So I guess the question is, what do we want to pay for, and then how much are we willing to, what quality of life do we want? So it kind of goes back to the other discussions that's been going on. And then a bunch of subsets behind it.
We have
Orange?
The orange group.
Okay, we tried to expand on our thoughts, and I think we're hitting in a different way or with different semantics on some of the same issues that Jay and Dave just brought up. The CEF need is real, but it should be paid by all users. There's a question whether the building permit process captures that, or whether that sole source of collection is inequitable. We felt that a more diversified collection process is needed, that growth needs to pay its proportionate way. I think you used the word proportionate in your initial presentation, Alan, but there's a different meaning, I think, to proportionate compared to the word own. Possible sources or possible collection tools, and without as much detail, these go back to some of the same things Jay hit on. Sales tax, adjustment of sales tax in one way or another, adjustment of property taxes. Direct user fees might be easier for some CEFs than others. Pretty easy to see how we might do it for library and museum, a little harder for parks, a little harder yet for streets. Broader district formation, we looked at why are libraries going to library districts, why are fire departments going to fire districts, why do we have hospital districts, why do we have school districts? How about a CEF district to capture some of the county users, non-resident users that we're not getting right now, which is what we focus with the building permit process.
Thank you. Very good thoughts. Very good, very well, very thoughtful groups, everybody. I appreciate that, and want to thank you very much for all the effort that you put in tonight.
No, I told you.
I want to let you know. Yes.
I Googled it.
Oh, somebody said same time.
Things are dangerous.
Okay, our next group meeting with you folks, and that is March the 7th. I said same time, it's 7 p.m. So, March the 7th at 7 p.m. we'll come back here in this place. You'll hear the presentations of all of the working group, what they've done to look at all the things that you've put together, not only your top priorities.
Can you tell us who the working group is?
Okay, Alan, if you could.
That'll be members of the boards and commissions that work directly with capital expansion fees. So we're going to take what you've done tonight to them. Gary will go back to his Parks and Rec board and explain what he heard tonight. Ask them some of these difficult questions. Dave will go to the Transportation Advisory Board and get some feedback on what you all have recommended. And then staff is going to do much of the work with the boards and commissions, and then we'll bring some kind of draft report back to you on March 7th. You'll get another chance to kick it around. If we need another meeting after that, there's time. What I'm worried about is we've kind of broadened this up, and if we go that philosophical route, we might not be able to make all of the deadlines that we've got in front of us. But what we plan to do is review whatever or what you brainstormed tonight with the commissions that work directly with the CES, and then bring some feedback to you in 5 weeks.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I just updated the slides on the comparisons between fees here in Loveland and Fort Collins, Greeley, Longmont, and Windsor. And these are Loveland's current fees for 2011. They were the same as 2010. Still waiting to hear back from some of the other communities, so it's not completely up to date. Jay said he'd still like to see it, so here it is. On single-family residence, looking at the total, so this takes into account building fees. Inside of building fees is also the use tax that's paid, any utility inspections, any utility planned investment fees, that's all in that line. CEFs are in the CEF line. There's one exception. Longmont has a public building fee of $1,000 on residences, and that's under miscellaneous. And for some reason, when this was set up, open lands, the 778, and Loveland was also set up as a miscellaneous. But looking at the bottom line, Loveland is the second highest at $33,253. Longmont was the highest on the single-family residence. Commercial retail, Loveland was again second highest.
What are we looking at here? Is this a certain size building?
It is. It is. Everybody did the same thing. In this case, commercial retail was about a 20,000, sorry, it's 9,166 square foot.
What year?
What year was this?
For Loveland, it is both 2010 and 2011. For all of the others, it's last year, and we're in the process of updating. So there might have been inflationary increases, or there might have been decreases. I don't know at this point, but we're every January we exchange data.
So this has been done each year? Because the first year you did this, wasn't that 6 or 8 years ago or so? Or has it been done longer than that?
This is done almost every year.
Is it?
Almost every year, yeah. So for commercial retail, comparable building in all of the cities, Loveland came in second highest again. Commercial office, Loveland came in the highest. And industrial came in the lowest. And it's really dependent on the largest fee, the streets fee, because we get very specific as to what the land use is. So you might pick another use, and the city of Loveland could move around because we have very fine detail on the street fees. So, and then I also did a calculation. I can't remember, was it you, Roger, that asked the inflation question? If we would have done the inflationary increases in those 12 or 14 years where there was none, I did it 2 different ways, so I came up with a range of about $16 million to $22 million. That's total on the $107 million that's been collected on all fees. It's probably short by somewhere between 17 and 22 million. But what I'll do is I'll go back and get the engineering news record and use that instead of, I just use a CPI proxy for that. I would suspect that construction costs are a little bit higher than general inflation. Yeah, that was the first one.
So I just want to suggest, Jay said, and I don't know, that he thought that Windsor had the most industrial development of any of these. I know it's really hard to tell, but it would be interesting to find out with these prices, what kinds of development are people getting? I mean, is it essentially a deterrent or not? You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
I don't know if we can do that.
So we
Not to
could
give you something to keep you up at night, but.
Don't keep Tom Hawkins up at night because he keeps track of all.
But it is kind of interesting to know if the numbers do impact.
This is fee only, but you also have to throw in the other factor. Loveland has got the lowest mill levy of any of those communities you have up there, I believe. Residential, commercial, and industrial.
Lowest sales tax and lowest mill levy.
And lowest sales tax, that's correct.
And the other thing we talked about during the break, Fort Collins has a library district. You get to pay 3 mills on top of the regular 9.7 mills. Greeley has a library and a fire district. Longmont has a library district. Windsor has a library and fire district. So all those mill levies, you just can't compare what the city's mill levy is.
All right, thank you very much. You guys, 9:30. Appreciate all your time, and we'll see you next meeting.